Thanks so much for staying with us here on Morning Live. Now, the announcement by ABSA yesterday that its CEO, Daniel Mminele, has stepped down has once again sparked the conversation around both transformation and succession in the financial services sector. And in a statement, ABSA says that Mminele's departure comes after it has become clear that there was a non-alignment between the former Reserve Bank Deputy Governor and the ABSA board on issues of strategy and transformation. Now, the Black Management Forum has lambasted the move, saying it is yet another indication of the poor treatment of black executives in especially the private sector. And while the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals attributes it largely to a lack of strategic support at board level, to discuss this further, we're joined by Chartered Accountant, political commentator and, of course, Treasurer at ABSA, Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good morning. Thanks for speaking to us.
Good morning and good morning to the viewers.
Now, Khaya, let's just look at what has happened here. Hardly 2 years into that particular job, we see another CEO leaving, black CEO in the banking sector after Basani Maluleke at African Bank. So are we to read anything specific into this, or is this just the markets doing their thing and people moving along?
No, I do think that there's a lot for us to read into it. And I think in particular, in the case of ABSA, Daniel Mminele was indeed their first black CEO. And you can imagine for an institution with a long history like ABSA, that on its own is quite an important statement for us to observe. What we've seen, unfortunately, in the case of ABSA is that it does indeed operate as an outlier in the banking sector. And why we call it an outlier is that the way banks have conditioned themselves is that they prefer to identify a potential leader, then groom them so that whenever somebody exits the scene, it is easy to find someone from within and say, please carry on and start running this race. What ABSA has done in recent times is that it has struggled to find leaders from within its own organization and then has had to go outside. So we remember 12 years ago when Steve Boyson left, they had to go and find Maria Ramos, who was still at Transnet at that point in time. So then Maria Ramos came in as the outside, and then she ran the bank for about 10 years. So 2 years ago, when she then decided that actually she wanted to get out of the system, so when she retired in February 2019, it then suddenly dawned on ABSA that they actually hadn't bothered to identify a successor within their own stable, which means that they had to go and look outside. That's how Daniel Mminele got into the system. The consequences, though, for ABSA is that obviously when you do actually go outside and look for a leader, it means that there's going to be a bit of a greater lead time for a person to try and understand that institution and then say, okay, now that I know what it's all about, this is what I want to do. So in our view, you cannot give a person 15 months for them to get into that zone. You cannot give a person 15 months at the height of a pandemic where even with the best minds possible, you couldn't have possibly preempted or planned what the past 12 months in particular are going to be about. So it is quite surprising and heavily disappointing to see how this has turned out.
Speaking of that institutional culture, Khaya, and reading some of what was put out in that statement by ABSA, they say, among other things, and I quote, the parties have not managed to achieve alignment in relation to the group's strategy and the culture transformation journey, unquote. Now, that begs the question, when they actually went out to appoint Mminele in that position, surely they would have looked into those specifics and made sure that they actually were aligned and this person would be able to bring whatever vision they have for the company to fruition.
A tricky one. So I would say ABSA in the past 2 years has probably had to deal with three types of strategies. The first strategy is the one that was actually initiated by Maria Ramos before she left. And that was a strategy really dealing with how to separate and disengage themselves from Barclays, where they had been involved since around 2005. So that obviously requires a different way of doing things and a different strategy. And it was a very, very involved and very detailed process. In fact, it was such a complex process, they actually even demanded $1 billion from Barclays to say, this is how you're going to help us finance this process. So that's the first part of the strategy. And of course, once that separation was going to be completed, which actually happened in the middle of last year, there was then always going to be the question of, well, what do you look like after this divorce has happened? So that's one different strategy altogether, which seeks to say this is how we're going to be running ourselves as a standalone brand. So that's the type of strategy that you have seen emerging from the time Maria Ramos exited until, unfortunately, the time Daniel Mminele started. So when Daniel starts, there are basically two things that materialize. The first one is a question of whether he's going to agree with the pre-existing strategy and simply say, I'm going to run with it. Or, like every other CEO out there, he's going to look at this and then say, actually, my view is that we should go into this particular direction. So that's the first thing I mentioned. The secondary dimension, which absolutely nobody could plan, is that even if Daniel loved the strategy that Upside crafted long before and wanted to adopt it, well, COVID-19 happened, which necessitated that absolutely every single CEO in every single institution needed to look at the strategy of where their business was and then say, this is how we're going to go, this is how we're going to navigate through this particular pandemic. So unfortunately, it's been a series of disruptions when it comes to the strategy fit, and unfortunately, they seem to have formed the view that the way Daniel conceptualized where he thinks the institution ought to go was not what everybody else, whether the executive team or indeed the board, thought the strategy needed to go. And that's where the meeting of the minds did not happen, and we saw what happened yesterday.
A meeting of the minds, not for the first time. We saw this with Basani Maluleke at African Bank, also cited as one of the reasons misalignment with the board. And once again, in this case with Daniel Mminele at ABSA, misalignment with the board. So let's talk about that relationship, its importance, and why it seems that these boards, by all accounts, would not hold on to these black CEOs, especially in the case of Basani, and looking at the key performance areas and how the bank had performed during her tenure. Why wouldn't they go all out to keep her?
The fundamental difference to the African bank scenario is that, remember, a strategy is not something you wake up overnight and say, here it is. It is something that is very methodical and quite lethargic, in that you literally have to tell people from inception, this is what you're looking at, this is what I'm considering, and this is what it might look like. So the board is not unaware of that strategy that is being formulated. So they go through that journey, and then at the point in time when you then have to execute that, and they sign it off, and then they say, go ahead and deal with it. So any institution that has had a CEO who's been part of the furniture for as long as Basani had been, for them to then come out and say there was differences of a strategy is, quite frankly, a lot of nonsense, because you have to imagine that when she started crafting the strategy with the executive team, they couldn't have left the board completely in limbo. They couldn't have left them completely unaware of what it is that we're thinking and how they were going to plan it. So when they then say that the basis for the departure is the fact that there was misalignment around strategy, it's quite simply a false premise. If it is indeed true, well, it implies that that's a board that is so disengaged, they shouldn't be in that position in the first place. So that's really my observation of what that particular situation was. And I suppose in the Daniel Mminele case, the fundamental difference here is that if you look at a 16-month period trying to learn what the institution's about, whereas probably still discovering where his parking lot is going to be, that person being an outsider needs a bit more time in order for them to assimilate into the organization, understand what the organization is about, and then start even conceptualizing what they think the strategy ought to be. Do I think he was rushed? Yes, I do think that he wasn't given enough breathing space for him to say, actually, this is what I think it ought to look like, and this is how we're going to get there. And I think the way that he's been treated probably reflects an inability from ABSA to actually really have an understanding of what it takes and what the consequences are of taking someone from the inside and trying to get them to run an institution as complex and as convoluted as ABSA.
And then, of course, some people have long criticized what has been referred to as a revolving door policy between the banks and Treasury, for example. And then you have Daniel Mminele, who was, of course, the Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank before stepping into this role as the CEO of ABSA. Let's talk about that and the broader transformation question within the banking sector. Why is it so difficult, seemingly, for transformation to take hold in the sector?
So I think when you talk about the revolving door question, it does refer to individuals who have worked either at National Treasury or they've worked in the Reserve Bank that then migrate into the private sector itself. At some point, that becomes really a consequence of market dynamics, in that if a person reaches a ceiling within National Treasury, you can't go beyond Deputy Director General, for example. You do start exploring out there, and I think the type of experience and the type of knowledge that a person who's worked at the South African Reserve Bank for 20 years, for example, a person who's been in National Treasury for over 15 years, that is the type of experience that is very difficult to find anywhere in South Africa. And if you then see the black professionals that have then made that transition, these are people who probably form a very small cohort of black professionals with an intimate understanding of how high-level finance works in that particular regard. So I do think that for the private sector, they are indeed a pot of gold and they're very attractive candidates. So that's how you see Lungisa Fuzile going into Standard Bank, mainly because the type of knowledge that he has, very few people who replicate. I think that's the source of that particular revolving door. Whether it's undesirable, I'm not particularly convinced. But if you see what the controls that have been put in place is, one of the reasons Daniel Mminele could already start working at ABSA in January 2021 is that there is indeed a rule that says if you're working at the Reserve Bank at that level of seniority, you can't wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to run a bank when you've been overseeing them for as long as you have done. So you actually had to sit at home for 6 months in what we call a cooling off period, and then only then could he join ABSA. Whether it's sufficient is a story of a secondary dimension. And obviously, the transformation question is particularly important for institutions as large as ABSA and all other banks, because unfortunately, their power and their market influence and their intersections with every other sector of the economy means that a lot of people see them as an illustration of what corporate South Africa looks like. So if you get around and you find out that there are institutions that do not seem to reflect the country's demographics, some people see that as a proxy of what happens in other institutions where perhaps access to information isn't as good as we have with the banks, because the banks are, by definition, quite transparent. But it is unfortunately reflective of the fact that transformation just isn't happening at those levels of executive leadership.
So what incentive is there for the banks to push a transformative agenda, given that banks are by and large seen as corporate super citizens? They can do pretty much whatever they like.
It's a tricky one, because I think the law of the land has to prevail at some point in time. But from the evidence that we've been tracking, particularly with the Banking Association of South Africa, you can see that there are glaring gaps in relation to matters of transformation at the executive level. I would say at the lower levels of management, there's been much greater progress if you look at the trends in the past 3 or 4 years. So there's much greater progress there if you go down the pyramid. The problem that we are trying to figure out is what happens as people seek to transition up the ladder, where suddenly you see there's a much greater concentration of white talent, for example. So if you look at even the leaders within the banking sector, according to the intelligence report, for example, you find that there's a majority of white males that are actually in executive positions within the banking sector. And the question is, why suddenly do white males emerge in those particular positions of executive leadership? And I think ABSA is giving us a very clear illustration of what the problem is. If you do not have a pipeline, if you do not have a succession plan, and you do find one black leader, when that person exits the system and there's suddenly no one else in the room to actually fill that vacuum, well, of course, you're going to see what exactly happened yesterday, where suddenly Jason Quinn has been installed as the interim director at ABSA. A couple of months ago at African Bank, they also went for a white male, and Gustav Robbenheimer was installed as the interim CEO. So that, for me, is reflective of the fact that we shouldn't just be focusing on who's in charge as CEO today. It's a question of, if this person wasn't there tomorrow, what legacy have they left behind in terms of transformation and executive pipeline development? And in the case of ABSA, the answer overwhelmingly over the past 12 years is an absolute no. They don't seem to know how to do that pipeline planning.
So just a final question, Khaya, looking at what has been happening, looking at how difficult it seems to have been for some black executives at the top in the banking sector, would you advise anyone, if anyone came to you today and said, Khaya, I've been approached to fill a position as CEO at ABSA, would you advise a black professional to go there?
If people come to me directly, I would charge them. And now you ask me on national television how to give this advice for free. No, I do not think that people should put up their hands without asking these organizations, firstly, what have you reflected in relation to how this episode has transpired? And then the secondary question of what is it that you're going to offer me as a support if I step into this particular position, because clearly I don't want to subject myself to the same treatment that I've seen, which is essentially a public humiliation for someone of Daniel Mminele's stature. So I would advise anyone who gets the call that says, are you looking to consider taking up this job, to ask them the difficult questions of how do they keep getting the succession questions so spectacularly wrong, and more importantly, how you as a new person are going to avoid falling into that into the corporate cliff, which has befallen so many black professionals in recent times.
Well, Khaya, thanks so much for your time this morning. And that, of course, was Khaya Sithole, the treasurer of ASBIB, talking to us about what we saw yesterday, the announcement of the resignation of Daniel Mminele from ABSA. He was, of course, the CEO, and seemingly by mutual agreement and no fault being attributed to either party, as per the statement that was released. He will now go on, and ABSA will try and find a successor. Right, it's time to bring you the